Okay, so in this lecture, I want to say something about missing premises. And we're actually going to spend some time on this. Your book only spends about 6 pages. We're actually going to spend a lot of time talking about this and even more time practicing it. Because I think this is actually both a really important but also somewhat difficult concept. And we'll talk about the reasons it's difficult. We'll get more into it as we go on. But I mean, one reason that this is difficult, and this is one of the issues that you'll see a lot with logic, and it's one of the things that I think makes logic both difficult sometimes, but also really interesting, is that logic draws on really different skill sets. As I said, a lot of logic looks a lot like math, but some of what you're going to be doing with filling in missing premises, and even some of the stuff you're going to be doing when you get to translating English into propositional logic. Propositional logic is very mathematical, but both filling in missing premises and the translation draw on skills that, are kind of maybe more at home in a literature class. So it's very interesting. I don't know if any other class you'll draw on like skills that are so far apart, so different. I think that's one of the things that makes logic fascinating, right brain and left brain together, right? Art and science. But it can also be a little tricky. So this is an issue we're going to keep coming back. This will pop up over and over again, where you kind of have to draw on both some very different skill sets and put them together. So let's start talking about this idea of missing premises. And you'll hear these called a lot of different things. You'll hear them called suppressed premises, assumed premises, assumptions, implied premises. Logic textbooks will say implied or suppressed premises. If you do tests like the LSATs, they will ask about assumptions or assumed premises. It's all getting at the same idea. And that idea is that the argument assumes a premise. In fact, it needs a premise to work that it doesn't explicitly state. Let me give you guys an example. We'll go with a few examples. Obviously, it is not always wrong to lie. If it were always wrong to lie, then it would be wrong to lie to a murderer to protect his intended victim. It's actually a fairly famous case in philosophy. Some philosophers, Kant most famously, St. Augustine also have said, well, it's always wrong to lie. And someone says, well, obviously it's not. If a murderer comes to your door, his victim's hiding in your house, and he says, well, where is this guy? Your only method of defense is to lie. Everybody says, well, you'll lie, right? So this is an argument against this claim that it's always wrong to lie. But look what the argument says. We've got two statements. Obviously, it's not always wrong to lie. If it were always wrong to lie, then it would be wrong to lie to a murderer to protect his intended victim. Now look, when we put this in premise and conclusion form, hopefully you guys can get a sense that there's a gap here, right? If it were always wrong to lie, then it would be wrong to lie to a murderer to protect his intended victim. It is not always wrong to lie. There's a gap between premise 1 and the conclusion. There's another premise here that this assumes, and it might be a pretty obvious one. I think to most of you it is, but it's not explicitly stated. And for the argument to actually work, we need to fill that gap in. We need to put that premise there. That premise, I'll use A for these a lot of times just to make them clear, and a dotted line like your book does. If it were always wrong to lie, then it would be wrong to lie to a murderer to protect his intended victim. Missing or assumed premise. The person thinks we're all going to think, well, of course it's not wrong to lie to a murderer to protect its intended victim. You should do that, right? We think of like people hiding Jews in their house during the Holocaust. Gestapo or the SS asks where they are, you should lie, right? Person making this argument counts on us all having that reaction, that this is obvious to us, but the argument doesn't work without it, right? It's an assumption, it's a premise it needs to work that the person doesn't say. So this is the way your book gives to diagram it. 1, the premise we already stated, with a solid line. A, the premise we filled in. The book uses numbers, but we'll just use A and B and stuff for now to make it clearer. And then 2 is our conclusion, right? this missing premise that the argument needs to work. In this case, it might be so obvious to a lot of us we don't even notice it's missing till we think about it, but the argument needs this premise. Otherwise, there's this gap between 1 and 2. Here's another argument, right? Since she's a self-described feminist, Laura is probably a liberal. Now look, let's look at this again, right? And again, the person is counting on us to fill something in. It's something that might seem pretty obvious to us, but if you notice it in premise and conclusion form, there's a gap here. There's a premise the argument needs to work that's not explicitly written out. Laura's a self-described feminist, so she's probably a liberal. There's a gap here, right? How do we get from her being a feminist to her politics, right? Like if you filled something else in here, this would be way less obvious, right? Laura is a bird watcher, so she's a liberal, right? If you filled it in that way, there'd be this huge gap. It'd be more apparent. This person is trading on us making assumptions about people who are self-described feminists, right? But without that assumption, there's this gap here. The argument needs this premise filled in to work, right? We might fill in the premise on some of these so quickly that it's hard to see that there is something missing, but if you change this to something else, the fact that this is a huge jump, there's something missing, would be way more apparent, right? If we said, she's a farmer or she's a stamp collector, then it'd be like, well, wait. How do the world we get from 1 to 2, right? In the same way here, we might make this assumption, we might fill this in for the person about feminists and liberals, but without it, the argument literally doesn't make sense, right? So again, we make explicit what the argument assumes and kind of counts on us filling in our head, right? Laura is a self-described feminist. Most self-described feminists are liberals. So Laura is probably a liberal, right? We're saying this about one group. Most of its members are also members of this other group, liberals, right? And again, 1 plus this missing premise with dependent support gets us to our conclusion that she's probably a liberal. Now I want you guys notice the support in both of these arguments. Both of these arguments have exactly the same structure. Both of these arguments involve dependent support. This one about lying, dependent support, right? This one about Laura being a liberal, again, dependent support. In both cases, the implied or missing premise, suppressed premise, whatever you want to call it, provides dependent support with another premise. That's the way that missing premises are always going to work. They're going to provide dependent support with another premise or premises to get to a conclusion or to get to the next step in an argument. You need this missing premise to support the argument. The premise or premises on their own aren't enough. They need something else to provide dependent support. So that's like one way to kind of tip ourselves off. We're dealing with a suppressed premise or missing premise, implied premise, whatever you want to call them, is you'll have these premises that need another dependent one to actually support what they're supposed to. Now, spotting when an argument has a missing premise is not really the tricky thing. It can be a little tricky, but I think usually when we start thinking about it, we can see when an argument makes a jump. The hard part often is filling in the missing premise or premises. Because I want you guys to notice there are a lot of ways we could have filled in this argument, that we could have filled in A here, that it needs to work. We could have said all self-described feminists are liberals. We could have said some self-described feminists are liberals. Premise we chose, most are liberals. You know, now look, there's different ways to word 3, you know, the majority, you know. But even beyond different ways to word 3, there's premises that obviously say different things that would bridge this gap, right? Or that seem to, right? So of these 3 premises, and you can maybe think of more, why did we choose A3, or why did I choose A3? Think about this a bit, and I think you guys will get a sense that A1 and A2 aren't as good. You know, of these 3, you know, maybe there's a even better way to fill it in than A3, but if we had to choose between these 3, A3 is clearly the better one, right? But I want you guys to think about this. Why is A3 better than A1? Why is A3 better than A2? I think there's different reasons, but think about this, why we would choose it over these other 2. Just to give you guys a hint, one of these is sort of Goldilocks thing here. One of these is a bit too much, a bit too strong. Think about why that's a problem. One of these is a bit too weak. Think about why that's a problem. Why is A3 just right? Now look, one of the reasons I'm going to spend a lot of time on this is filling in missing premises is tough. It is something that is hard. I'm not going to lie to you guys about that and say, oh, you should just get this, you know, whatever. It's tough. It's as much an art as a science, right? We'll talk more about some rough guidelines for this, but it's one of those things I don't think you can get good at without just practice, 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 practice. So guess what we're going to do? Next class after these lectures, we're going to practice, practice, practice with this, right? There's just no way, I think, to actually get better at this, to even get decent at this without some practice. Once you get some practice, I think you'll just start to get a feel for what should go in. Like I said, we'll talk about some guidelines and some rules in the next 3 lectures, but we will need to practice for you to actually be able to do this. All right. And one thing I will say, too, is that there's going to be some room for debate about how we should fill missing premises in. If on our exam you get multiple choice, A, B, C, D, or if you're taking the LSAT or a test like that that has a logic component, and they give you A, B, C, or D, there will always be one of the 4 or 5 or whatever that is way better than the other 3 or 4. That is the right answer given the others. The problem is, in real life, you're not going to have multiple choice, right? And in real life, there's going to be some room for debate about the absolute best way to fill the missing premise in. There just is. If you can ask the person what they meant, great, they tell you, that settles it. If you're just reading something on a page, listening to a YouTube clip of somebody talk, and you can't ask them for clarification, you are often going to have to do this, filling in missing premises. There will be some room for debate, though, about the best way to do it. All right, so let's move on, and we'll talk about just some helpful tips about how to do this, and maybe a little bit more about why it is tricky in the next couple lectures. Actually, the next 3 lectures.